Now, in some cases, you actually want to walk on the bearing. In the case of the church, we were just seeing what direction it was in, the vague direction. But sometimes you actually want to walk on the bearing. So a lot of the time, walking on a bearing is going to be more for if you're somewhere with a lot fewer obvious features. So this map has quite a lot that I can follow, but just for the sake of instruction, I will show you how to actually walk on a bearing. So I'm just here. I've just come underneath the railway. So see the railway up there. I've just come underneath it and I'm now in this field. So I want to follow the footpath in this direction. So first thing I'm going to do is take that bearing. So putting this, making sure my direction travel arrow's in the right direction, putting the side of my compass along the direction of the path, and then lining up my orienting arrows with the grid lines. Okay, so there's my grid bearing. Now, of course, we'd want to add our grid magnetic angle, but that's only 1/2 degree, so I'm not actually going to even try to add that. So, to actually walk on this bearing, holding the compass nice and flat, we put the red to bed. So we put the north of the magnetic needle into the orienting arrow. So there we are, nicely oriented. And then we look at where that is pointing us to. And actually in this case, I can see the star that I'm heading to, but a lot of the time you won't be able to. And what you don't want to do is walk along staring at the compass like this, because you may very easily drift off course and not realise it. Okay, so what you actually want to do is, while still having that compass in front of you so that you can refer to it, you want to fix on something in the distance that you're walking towards that is on that bearing. So in this case, if I couldn't see the stile, then I'd aim for that second tree in from the left. Slightly darker tree is what looks like is on my bearing. So that's how you would walk on a bearing. And sometimes you might want to turn around and go exactly the opposite way from where you came from. So whether that's because you've realised you've been walking on the wrong bearing and you need to walk back to where you last knew exactly where you were, whether it's because somebody's got injured or ill and you need to get back to the last easily found checkpoint, or maybe you found your objective, so a checkpoint or a geocache or whatever you were looking for, and you just want to go back. Now, rather than taking a whole new bearing, if I want to just walk back on the exact bearing that I came from, all I need to do, turn myself round and put the white end of the needle into my orienting arrow. And then I can walk on that, which is known as a back bearing, and I'll get back to exactly where I came from. Okay, so another time where using bearings can be really useful is when you've got a lot of paths to choose from. So you can see where I am in these woods. I've got 1, 2, 3, you can just see that behind the tree, 4, 5 down to the left there, and 6. Okay, if I look at my map, I know I'm here because I've got this nice handy orienteering post that tells me I'm at 1. So I know my location, but if I look at that location on this map, there are only 5 paths coming off of it. So one of these paths is probably what is called a desire line, which is basically where people have walked, but it's not an official path. And I think, looking at the shape of them, that it's this one here. And people have walked there and it's been trodden down, but it's not an official path that is on this orienteering map. But the best way to work that out is to take a bearing to where I want to go. Now I would like to follow this path all the way along and get to orienteering post number 5, So I'm going to take a bearing from this path. Now I don't want to take a bearing to number 5. I want to take a bearing of what angle that path is doing right now. I'm going to take a bearing from point 1 along that path, and initially the bit of path that I should see will be going in this direction. So all I've lined up is the point where I am with the first bend in the path. So that's the bit of path that I'll be able to see from my current location. And I'm now going to line up the orienting lines, and that is lined up, and I will take that off and be able to take the bearing, or see the bearing on which the path that I want to take is. So remembering to hold our compass nice and flat, what we need to do is put the red to bed, which means we're parking that magnetic north arrow, and I've made sure to take it away from my phone now so the magnets aren't interfering. Okay, I've now parked the arrow in the orienting arrow. Okay, so my direction of travel arrow is now going to point in the direction I want to go. If I look up, I can now see that it is this path to my left here that I need to take. And the other thing that I'm going to show you while I'm walking down this path to find post number 5 is how to keep a bit of a track of how far you've walked. And there are 2 ways that we could do that. Those are pacing and timing. So in terms of both of them, we need to work out how far it is between these 2 points. And I've used the scale down at the bottom of my map. It's quite rough, but I've judged where each of these squares is 100 meters. I've judged that between points 1 and 5, I'm going to be doing about 200 meters. So timing wise, if I was walking at 4 kilometers an hour, then 1 kilometer takes me 15 minutes. 100 meters takes me 1.5 minutes. So that 200 meters should take me about 3 minutes. And the other way is to use pacing. Now, I know how many paces I take to 100 meters, but this is something that you'll have to gradually learn and work out once we actually start doing some face-to-face. So when you're doing pacing, you have to find a place that's 100 meters long. So you can either find somewhere obvious like a running track, or you could measure it out using GPS, or find somewhere on a map. But you then need to count how many paces you do in that 100 meters. And you count it just on the one leg. So as you walk, you would just count 1, 2, 3, 4 until you get to your 100 meters. Now I know that mine is about 66 paces for 100 meters. So I'm going to go down this path. I'm going to keep an eye on the time. So it's on 32:20. So that should be on about 35 when I get to 0.5. And I'm going to count to 66 paces twice. So let's go. So that's 66 paces, so we should be about halfway there. So we're 100 meters in. Okay, so that's another set of 66 paces. So I've done about 200 meters. And if you look at the time as well, I've just coming up to 35 minutes, so it's taken just under 3 minutes. I was walking at a fair pace. And if I just look up, we can see just over here, well, for starters, here's path junction, which is what I was expecting. And just over here is number 5. Now, I haven't measured that out or anything beforehand. I've just judged that 200 meters on the map. and use my pacing and timing to be sure that this is where I needed to get to. And it's very useful for if you're expecting to see perhaps a path on your left, and if you use pacing or timing to keep track of how far you've gone, then you know whether you might have missed it, or if you see another path that's a bit earlier than you think, then perhaps that's not the path that you need. So it's always really useful to use your pacing or your timing to judge whether you're at the right place. So we've seen how you can use bearings from the map to work out what you're doing on the ground. We can also take a magnetic bearing and then put it onto the map in order to work out exactly where we are. So for example, I'm somewhere on this path here. Now maybe for some reason I've not been keeping track of where I am, and I'd like to have a bit more of an idea of where I am. So I am going to use this same church, but I'm in quite a different position. So I can see this church over in the distance there. So in order to take my bearing from the church and put it to the ground, first thing I need to do is get my compass and point my direction of travel arrow as close towards that church as I can do. And then while keeping it pointing that way, I'm going to take the bearing. So keep the compass pointing towards the church, and then turn the bezel until the magnetic north is inside the orienting arrow. Okay, so magnetic north is inside the north orienting arrow at the same time as my direction of travel is pointing at the church. So that's how I've taken a magnetic bearing straight off that church. Now to put this onto the map, we're going to consider our grid magnetic angle, but it's only 1/2 degree. If it were bigger than that, I would take it away, because mag to grid, get rid. So I would take off 1/2 degree, but it's not worth doing that because it's such a small amount on this small bezel. In order to now use that to work out where I am, this is the path that I know I'm on somewhere, and this is that church. What I'm going to do is put the side of the compass on the church, and then I'm going to turn the whole compass, not the bezel. Okay, the bezel's set, that's in the direction I want. Turn the whole compass so that the orienting lines are lined up with the grid lines. Okay, and then I'm going to slide it to make sure that it's definitely lined up with the church. I need my direction travel arrow to be pointing from me to the church. So there's the church just hidden under there. My orienting arrows are pointing north up my map. So let's just get something pointy. It's always good to use something nice and pointy to point at your map. So I should be about here on that path. So if I take my compass away, this is where I should be. And I've just crossed one boundary. I should expect to cross one more. And then in about 100 meters after that, there'll be a track to my right. So here's that final boundary. So it's looking good so far that I did a good bearing to judge where I am on the path. And then looks like there's that track on the right. And it's always good to go to a junction to confirm it's the one you think it is, rather than just see it in the distance. Let's go and look. And here we are. So from that bearing I took, I judged I was about here on the map. I came along here, crossed one more boundary, and then I've got myself to here where I've got a footpath going off in the same direction as I was heading, and then a nice big track, a restricted byway heading off in this direction. So that was a pretty good bearing. It pointed me where I thought I was. Now, the other thing you can do is use more than one bearing to pinpoint where you are, and that's going to be useful if you are perhaps not on a defined track, if you are on Exmoor, Dartmoor, or just up on the Mendips where there's lots and lots of tracks about. And you can use multiple bearings to pinpoint where you are. Now, where I am just now, there's a few too many hedges, not quite enough obvious landmarks to be able to show you that. Okay, so I couldn't find a good place while I was out walking to show you this, so I'm just going to show you on a map, and you need to use a little bit of imagination. So in the previous clip, we knew that we were vaguely somewhere along a path, and we used one bearing to pinpoint where we are on this path. Now, another method is called resection, or you may hear it called triangulation, and that is using multiple bearings to pinpoint where we are if we only have a vague idea of where we are. So we have to know slightly where we are, because otherwise we wouldn't know which bit of the map we're looking at. So if we saw a church, we'd want to know which church that is compared to the map. So I can see 3 just from glancing at this map. There may be more on here. So we need to know roughly where we are. So I'm using a map that's a little closer to the squadron. So obviously the squadron's up here in Headley Park. So we're going to have a look at Dundry. Now, resection is generally better if you're somewhere quite open, somewhere with a good view all around. So let's imagine we've walked up Dundry and we know that we're somewhere here around in Dundry Downs, but we're not quite sure where we are. So we're going to try and pinpoint where we are from taking bearings to a few features. So when we're taking these bearings, we want to make sure that we're taking a bearing to quite a specific point. If I saw the Barrow tanks, then I wouldn't want to just take a rough bearing to somewhere within the reservoir. I'd want it to be quite specific. So I know that from up here somewhere in Dundry, I can see the gap between the 2 reservoirs. So I would take a bearing to that, and then we'd probably be able to see these radio masts. And if we could see all 3, then we need to pick one so that we get a more accurate bearing. So just pick the one. If you know that you're seeing this one, take a bearing to that. And then the third thing I'm going to take a bearing to is, let's say that we could see this road junction, and it's quite a recognisable one by the angles of the roads. So if we already know that we're up here, we can recognise this road junction if we could see it. Now, I'm not promising that any of this stuff will be visible from where you would be standing, because there might be hedgerows in the way, or the shape of the hill might mean that we can't see a particular feature. But let's assume that we can see these 3 features. So the first thing we would need to do is to take magnetic bearings to those 3 features in the real world. So this is the bit that takes a bit of imagination. You're going to have to assume that I've done that, but I would be doing it exactly the same way as in the previous clip, where I'd be pointing my direction of travel arrow at the feature, so either at this bit of the reservoir, at the radio masts, or at the fork in the road, and then moving the bezel until the magnetic north on the needle is inside the orienting arrow. So let's assume that I've taken those bearings, and the bearing from me to the reservoir is 325 degrees. So make sure that that's on my compass, and I'm then going to place my compass on the map and line up the orienting lines with the grid lines on my map, if I can see them. Sometimes it's quite tricky to see them underneath the compass bezel. And once that's lined up, I'm then going to slide the whole thing until the side of my compass is on the point that I was looking at in the real world. So I now know that I am somewhere on this line. If you do ever need to draw on a map, please do it lightly in pencil so that you can erase that and it's not in the way for the next person that uses this map. Okay, to the next feature, I measured 92 degrees to the radio masts. So let's put that on my compass. And I would take off my grid magnetic angle if it was a reasonable number. And then again, pointing my direction travel arrow at the radio masts, I'm going to line up the whole compass with the grid lines. Make sure that I'm at the right one of the radio masts. Oops. And then drawing a line there. Now already I know that I'm somewhere in this area, and depending on how accurately I've taken my bearings, I could be just where they cross there. So sometimes you might only need to take 2 bearings. But the reason some people call it triangulation is we quite often want to take 3 bearings and make a triangle because it's more accurate. So the final bearing that I took was to Grove Farm down here. I could see this junction at the bottom of the hill that I'm on. So finally, I'm going to put my compass on there, line up my orienting arrows. So there we are, nicely lined up. Slide it back to Grove Farm. And then my final line will pinpoint where I am. And depending on how accurately you've taken your bearings, this might be quite a large triangle, or it might be quite small. In this case, it's ended up that it's quite small, so my position is somewhere within that triangle. And the more accurately you take your bearings, and the more of these points that you take, the more accurate that can be, and the smaller the triangle will be. So this video has shown you how to take a bearing and a few ways that you can use it. And do practice using a bearing as much as you can, even when it's quite a nice obvious route, because then when you are in the middle of nowhere and you need to take a bearing to find out where you are, then you'll be able to do that.